Michigan purchase agreement. So we are going to go right into it. So, because you guys have waited all weekend for this day 3. So, number 11, heating and cooking fuels. Now, if you live in a place that has propane or natural gas, this is going to be vital. So, liquid heating and cooking fuels in tanks are included in the sale, of course, unless they're rented. And then you need to make sure that your seller tells your buyers that. And will transfer to the buyer at time of possession unless usage is metered, in which case it is not included in the sale. Sellers are responsible for maintaining heating and cooking liquid fuels at an operational level and shall not permit fuels to fall below 10% in the tanks at the time of possession, except that the tanks may be empty only if now empty. So, guys, this means that if you are doing propane and there is 50% of propane in the tank when you're making that offer, then you have to make sure that it's at least 10% at the time of possession. So do your walkthroughs. Your walkthroughs are vital. And then if there isn't any propane or less than 10%, just having your buyers know that they don't need to make sure that it's in there. Assessments. If the property is subject to any assessments, the seller can pay the entire balance, which is what you should pick, in my opinion. All assessments are due and payable on or before the day of closing, regardless of any installment arrangements, except for any fees that are required for future connection to public utilities. So, if there is an assessment that is for, they put in a new sidewalks and they're charging everybody an assessment for it in the township, the seller is to pay that off. Maybe it's $5,000 when they sell it. The other option is the seller shall pay all installments of such assessments that become due and payable on or before the day of closing. You don't want to do that. You don't want the buyer then to assume all other installments for such assessments if you can help it. They just would take on that debt already, and it's pretty easy to get the seller to pay it. Now, going into property taxes. Oh, and I want to say one more thing about assessments. You can find these on township websites. You can call the township. Just make sure that you're looking for assessments. Property taxes. The seller will be responsible for any taxes billed prior to those addressed below. Buyer will be responsible for all taxes billed after those addressed below. So, buyers also advise that the state equalized value of the property, which you can find on the township sites, principal resident exemption information, and any other real property tax information is available from the appropriate local assessor's office. Buyers should not assume that buyer's future tax bills on the property will be the same as the seller's. Never assume that. It's never going to happen. And under Michigan law, real property tax obligations can change significantly when property is transferred. So, would you rather have it prorated, calendar year proration, or fiscal year proration? I want you guys to forget about fiscal year because there's only 2 options, at least where I'm from. There's no proration and calendar proration. So, no proration means that you're choosing whether the buyer or the seller pay all or nothing on the taxes and or paying a certain amount. Calendar year just means everybody's responsible for the days that they own. So if you sell on January 2nd, you are responsible for January 1st. Buyer closes on January 2nd. They're responsible for taxes from January 2nd till December 31st, and that will come out of closing. So it's a full number divided by 365 days, and then it's divided by those days, and you have a daily amount, and then the days that you own the property are the days that you have to pay those taxes. Well and septic. Within 10 days after the effective date, either buyer or seller, the buyer is either going to ask the seller or say that they'll do it, will arrange for, at their own expense, an inspection of the primary well used for human consumption, including a water quality test for coliform bacteria and nitrates and septic systems in use on the property. The inspection will be performed by a qualified inspector in a manner that meets county or other local governmental authority protocol, if it's applicable. If any report discloses a condition unsatisfactory to the buyer or does not meet the county standards, that are a condition of sale, buyer may, within 3 days after buyer has received the report by written notice to seller, either terminate this agreement and receive a refund of their EMD, or make a written proposal to correct those conditions. If you fail to make a written proposal within the above referenced time period, the buyer is deemed to have accepted the well and septic as is. And then it goes over how long that the seller will respond. If the seller fails to respond or to arrive at a mutually agreeable resolution within 3 days, the buyer will have 3 days to provide written notice of termination. If they fail to terminate, they will proceed. The other section, I like to tell all of my mentees who's going to pump it. I have had inspectors come in there and say, I cannot give you your inspection report until I get a pump card, because I cannot properly look at this well and septic until you've pumped it, because it's so full. We don't know if it's just full because it's overflowing. Is it broken? Is it saturated? They don't know. So I always throw in there, hey, the buyer will pump, or asking seller to pump if the inspector deems needed. And that is the exact verbiage I would use. Inspections. Buyer or someone selected by buyer has the right to inspect the buildings, premises, components, and systems at buyer's expense. Any damage, misuse, abuse, or neglect of any property of the property or premises as a result of inspections will be the buyer's responsibility and expense. Investigations. It is the buyer's responsibility to investigate whether the property complies with applicable codes and local ordinances, and whether the property is zoned for the buyer's intended use, whether the buyer can obtain a homeowner's insurance policy for the property at terms and price that are acceptable, and whether or not the property is in a flood zone. Those are all on the buyer. All inspections and investigations will be completed within. Now, everybody does this differently. Some people say 10 days, some people say 5 days. I say 3 days or less, or 5 days or less, depending on your client, but let them know that time is of the essence and everything stops, right? You can send everything you want into your lender. They're not going to order the appraisal. They're not going to get that in motion until after the inspections. Do you really need 10 days? Never have I ever needed a full 10 days. If the results of buyer's inspections and investigations are not acceptable to buyer, the buyer may, within the above reference period, either terminate the agreement by written notice to seller and receive a refund of buyer's EMD, or make a written proposal to correct those unsatisfactory conditions, which the proposal must be in the form of a proposed addendum and must be signed by buyer in order for it to be effective. If buyer fails to make a written proposal within the reference time period, the buyer will have been deemed to accept the property as is. The seller may negotiate with the buyer, or by written notice to buyer, accept buyer's proposal or terminate this agreement. If the seller fails to respond or to arrive at a mutually agreeable resolution within 3 days after the seller's receipt of any applicable EMD, the buyer shall have 3 days to provide written notice of termination, and they will receive a refund of any EMD. If the buyer fails to terminate, just like above, then they will have deemed to accept these